With the end of the decade on the horizon, I thought it'd be as good a time as any to take a look back at some of the stuff that made 2010 through 2019 such a fantastic time to be playing video games. Now, these may not be the objectively best games to come out in the last 10 years, but they are the ones that meant the most to me. With that said, before we go too far, I do want to throw out some honourable mentions, games that felt indicative of the decade but didn't quite stack up against the ones that actually made the cut. Without further ado, here are the honourable mentions. First up is Crash Bandicoot the N. Sane Trilogy. Few things were as emblematic of the 2010s as last-gen remasters and remakes of old games, and when I think of these, 2018's Crash Bandicoot remake is the first game that comes to mind. With completely overhauled visuals and audio, the N. Sane Trilogy repackaged 3 of my personal favourite childhood games for a new generation to enjoy, while keeping its classic gameplay mostly intact. But it also felt like it was leading the charge for new, high-quality ground-up remakes to follow. The industry had pumped out Oddworld New and Tasty a few years prior, sure, but after the Crash revival there was the Spyro Reignited trilogy, Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled, and the exceptional Resident Evil 2 remake. Now, I'm certain that at least one of these games would have seen the light of day without the N. Sane Trilogy. I mean, the FF7 remake has been in the works for 5 years now, but it's hard to look at the current deluge of returning classics and not see Crash near the head. Next up is Monster Hunter World Iceborne. Live service games are the new industry flavour of the month, but for me that often means that we get games that release long before they're truly worth the cost of admission. Hell, sometimes that means that the game is in customers' hands before they're even functioning properly. Bethesda. No matter which one I tried, be it Destiny 1 and 2, Anthem, or Fallout 76, none of them did anything for me when they launched and required too much time investment and patience before they ever became worthwhile. But Monster Hunter World was excellent from minute 1, with a ton of giant boss-style monsters to track, hunt and harvest, and weapons and gear to craft, without succumbing to industry standards like blind boxes and microtransactions. And it would have been so easy to gouge every bit of quality out of this game to monetize it as well. But Capcom didn't. Not only did they behave themselves on that front, Monster Hunter World continued to receive constant seasonal updates and event hunts, with plenty of additional monsters added along the way. This kept me playing the game for about a year and a half before Iceborne, the game's first paid expansion, dropped, which added almost an entire extra game's worth of content on top of the base game. And then Capcom kept adding more stuff on top of that for free. This is how games as a service should work. It's the kind of thing that still keeps me hopeful when I hear that next year's Avengers game is supposed to have live service elements. Monster Hunter World Iceborne is so goddamn good at what it does, and for me at least, it puts every other ongoing game to shame. Well, that about does it for my honourable mentions. I suppose I could have talked about PUBG or Fortnite, but I'm not much of a Battle Royale guy, so I don't know what I would have really said about that, but I'm getting distracted. Back to the best games of the decade, which again are not the best games of the decade, but they are my favourites. It's just easier to say the best games of the decade. You understand, you guys are smart, you'll get it. Here we go! Number 10, Bayonetta 2. Hey, remember the Wii U? No? That's fair. Nestled in the dark period between Nintendo's ludicrously successful Wii and the undeniably cool Switch, the Wii U had a rough go of things. It wasn't as powerful as either of the 6-year-old consoles it was competing against, and third-party support just wasn't really there for it. Also, it had a weird tablet controller that just wasn't as versatile as the motion controls of the Wii, even if some games used it to great effect. But what it did have, and what it would eventually pass on to the Nintendo Switch, was 2014's Bayonetta 2, which is just about the best action game I've ever played. Bayonetta 2 is fast-paced and hard-hitting, and Platinum Games just get how to make this kind of combat satisfying and rewarding to really learn. Fighting the legions of heaven in frantic and flashy encounters never gets boring, and every time it threatens to wear a bit thin, Bayo 2 would throw an intense boss fight at you which pushed your reaction times to their breaking point. And also it just looked and sounded amazing. Like I said, the game's encounters are fast and flashy, but it's also super colourful, and somehow, passing the on-screen action doesn't become a nightmare for your eyes. And then there's that uplifting, infectious soundtrack. Sometimes I'll be doing something in my day-to-day life and I'll just have the Bayo 2 version of Moon River pop into my head and I can't help but smile. Not only was Bayonetta 2 a highlight of the Wii U, it was a highlight of the character action subgenre overall. Platinum Games were keeping the subgenre in style with standout titles such as Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, Transformers: Devastation, and The Wonderful 101, all while Capcom struggled to figure out what to do with Devil May Cry. And there was Bayonetta 2, standing above them all, insane leg proportions and horrifying bodysuit made of witch hair shining for all to see. Which I promise is way cooler than I made it sound. Number 9. Alien Isolation. I've always loved Alien and Aliens, but 2014's Alien Isolation may just be the best thing to come out of that franchise since, well, ever. Certainly the best Alien-related media to release after those first two films, and it doesn't hurt being the first Alien game after the abysmal Aliens Colonial Marines, that's for sure. But what makes it so exceptional? Apart from its dedication to the retro sci-fi aesthetic of the original film and its stunning visuals and sound design, Alien Isolation is a horror game that manages to balance its tension-building downtime and its heart-stopping scares without relying on scripted jump scares or heavy cutscene use. Once you know that the alien is active in the environment, it's practically always there, but the developer's brilliant implementation of macro and micro AI behaviors keeps it from being so overbearing that you can't make progress, or so inept that it isn't threatening. Enemy AI is something that games to this day still manage to have trouble with, but Alien Isolation practically relies on the AI of a single creature, and it does so to great effect. After a stretch of gameplay where you haven't felt threatened, the alien's director brain will tell it what general area you're in, while its own sensory AI takes over when it comes to the details of actually hunting you down. Add to that the fact that it unlocks new behaviors as you play in certain ways so that the alien looks like it's learning from you, and you have a truly terrifying foe to deal with, and I can assure you that I'm actually underselling this. Man, I haven't even talked about Alien Isolation's narrative, which manages to build on what the film's established without trampling all over it, unlike some games. Seriously, fuck Aliens Colonial Marines, that game is garbage. Anyway, everyone should play this game, especially since there's a new port on the Switch that looks and performs so much better than it has any right to. It is, hands down, the best horror game of the past decade. Fight me. Number 8. Portal 2. When I first started playing 2011's Portal 2, I wasn't expecting much. 4 years before, the original Portal had blown my mind with its unique mechanics, clever puzzle design, and biting wit, but it felt like Valve had caught lightning in a bottle. So, when Portal 2 not only caught that same lightning again, but caught about 5 more bottles of the stuff at the same time, I was shocked. How could a sequel possibly have done more with such a thoroughly explored gimmick? How could a game that was primarily a mechanical showcase garnished by savage jokes directed at the player be succeeded by something that actually had a fun story with interesting characters and a surprising amount of world building? To this day, I have no idea how Portal, a game that relied so heavily on its gameplay, could spawn a sequel that not only added plenty of cool elements to that gameplay formula, but also managed to deliver on the narrative and comedic fronts without ever feeling like it was trying too hard. From its physics-altering colored gels and the interplay between them and the established Portal physics, to the plot that explored the history of aperture science and its colorful characters, Portal 2 is fantastic. It's a masterpiece. I also think it's worth mentioning how much more alive Portal 2 feels than its predecessor. A lot of that is thanks to an expanded cast of great characters, but the change in scenery from the ruined aperture testing course of Portal 1 to the long-buried remnants of the facility and all the behind-the-scenes catwalks and conveyor belts in between them really makes the difference. Portal 1 gave players a really sterile environment, which served its purpose perfectly, but Portal 2's greater variety gave it more personality and helped it stay fresh for its much more substantial runtime. It is a testament to the game's high quality that even though it released near the start of the decade, few puzzle games managed to stand alongside it since. The Witness is the closest game that I can think of, but even that stands entirely on its mechanics and doesn't quite deliver the same total package that Portal 2 does. Also, Portal 2's co-op is a gift to trolls of all ages, as well as being a genuinely fun and challenging mode for the nerds that want to complete them properly, whatever that means. People may be clamoring for Valve to release a new entry in the long-dormant Half-Life franchise, but frankly, all I want is a new Portal game.
At all, does any of this make any sense? Just tell me, just say yes. Okay, what you're doing there is jumping. You just jumped. But never mind, say apple. Apple. Okay, you know what? That's close enough. Just hold tight.
Number 7. Shovel Knight. When I think about the past 10 years of video games, there are a few things that come to mind first. There's the surge in game remakes, the boom in battle royale popularity, and the industry's love of aggressive monetization, but one trend in particular stands out to me: the rise of crowdfunding. And no game stands as a testament to the virtues of crowdfunding quite like 2014's Shovel Knight. Shovel Knight was announced in 2013 alongside a Kickstarter campaign that would go on to raise over $300,000, and since then it's been released on the Wii U, the 3DS, the Xbox One, the PS3, the PS4, and the PS Vita, and practically every other platform you can think of. It's had 3 full campaign updates that feature entirely new adventures with new playable characters and mechanics, and an entirely separate competitive mode, and they've all been of comparable quality to the original release, which was fantastic. In a world where 2D platformers with retro visuals and old school music are a dime a dozen, Shovel Knight always stood out to me as one of the best, with responsive controls, challenging platforming sequences, and more modern elements such as corpse runs to offset its clear retro inspirations. On that note though, Shovel Knight does a great job of not pandering to fans of the old NES games that it's clearly mimicking. It doesn't have any overt references to Mega Man or DuckTales or Castlevania despite utilizing ideas from each of these, and I think that gives it a bit of integrity that many retro-style indie games just don't have. At the end of the day though, Shovel Knight is just a really solid, well put together game. Its pixel art graphics, which bring a modern flair to the NES style that it's going for, as well as its absolute banger of a soundtrack, have helped it to endure for the better part of the decade, and with all those extra additions over the years, it really does feel like the crowdfunding game that keeps on giving, especially when you look at others like Mighty No. 9 or Yooka-Laylee that just fell a bit flat on their initial release. Number 6. Dishonored. The 2010s gave us plenty of inventive settings to explore, from the extreme heights and depths of the BioShock franchise to the cyclical dark fantasy of the Dark Souls series. But few worlds were as interesting and fully fleshed out as the Empire of Isles, introduced to us through Dunwall in 2012's Dishonored. From Weeper-infected slums that crawl with vermin to the luxurious manors that house rats of a different kind, Dunwall's environments were full of variety, dripping with character, and rewarded players who took the time to find their secrets. And to that point, taking the time to search every corner of Dishonored's various maps was really fun, thanks to its intricate map design that accounted for any and all combinations of abilities and techniques. You want to rush through the main entrance and use your swashbuckling skills to deal with any opposition? You got it. Want to use double jumps and well-timed blinks to stalk the rooftops and avoid confrontation? Go for it. Dishonored's unique range of abilities combined with its multifaceted approach to map design makes for a game that you could easily play over and over without repeating the same sequence in the same way twice. Finally, the game features an excellent story brought to life by striking visuals and some fantastic voice work. Dishonored's unique combination of steampunk and mysticism, wrapped in a somewhat exaggerated, almost caricaturesque style, gives it a distinct look that stood out in a sea of games that, in terms of visual fidelity, might technically look better. It also gave a fittingly unreal quality to this unreal story, where you're granted otherworldly powers by an eldritch being of unknowable power. It's all just really cool. Now, why does Dishonored make the cut and not its sequel? Well, it has the benefit of being the emphatic introduction to this world, its style, and its approach to gameplay. Dishonored 2 may have some really fantastic visual elements of its own, and it does have the single coolest level in video games, the Clockwork Mansion, but it's hard to look past our first adventure in the Empire, for me at least.
Someone help me out!
Number 5. The Last of Us. If you want to talk about the last decade of video games, it would be crazy not to talk about at least one linear blockbuster narrative game, and frankly, Naughty Dog's 2013 magnum opus, The Last of Us, might just be the best game of that style. If The Last of Us was simply about journeying across the zombie-infested ruins of the United States to deliver humanity's last hope against the infection, then it would have been compelling enough. But The Last of Us layers on plenty of interpersonal drama in the form of Joel and Ellie, who are exceptionally well written. They aren't always the most affable characters around, which makes sense considering how grim the game's setting is, but the brief moments of levity that they share contrast really well with this dark and hopeless world, and against their more tense and dramatic interactions. And with a less capable cast, none of this would be all that memorable, but the game's performances truly bring it to life. Troy Baker's turn as the older, grizzled Joel is filled with cynicism and regret, and Ashley Johnson's performance as the naive and rough-around-the-edges Ellie was both surprising and charming. With all that said though, a great story only does so much for a game, and The Last of Us backs up its excellent plot and performances with deliberate but riveting gameplay. The subtle lack of grace of the cover-based shooting, the dynamic and hard-hitting melee combat, the razor-sharp stealth mechanics, all of them help to create this tense and dangerous feeling tale of survival, without relying completely on the game's written elements. I know a lot of people dump on The Last of Us for not being as smooth and responsive as other shooters, but to me, that's always been the point. You're a survivor in a world that will probably kill you. Nothing is supposed to feel easy or smooth, and I've got massive respect for any game that employs its mechanics without bending to the established norm that people expect. The Last of Us is a perfect blend of cinematic storytelling and gameplay that successfully imparts its intended tone, and it all looked and sounded like a next-gen game before the next-gen even arrived. It is a truly impressive work.
What about the guy?
He ain't even hurt.
Alone and forsaken by fate and by man. Oh Lord, if you hear me, please take my hand.
Number 4. The Outer Worlds. For the longest time, 2010's Fallout New Vegas was the epitome of RPGs for me. It had this massive world full of colourful characters and varied factions, and you could really make your character into anything. But after souring on the Fallout franchise in recent years, it was nice to see that New Vegas spark emulated in Obsidian's latest game and the most recent release on this list, 2019's The Outer Worlds. Set in the corporation-controlled Halcyon colony, The Outer Worlds is possibly the most darkly humorous game I've ever played, presenting players with a setting that takes late-stage capitalism to its most grim and hilarious extremes, while also being one of the most enjoyable RPGs of its type. It gives players a handful of smaller but more densely packed world to explore, and doesn't skimp on plotlines that play factions off against one another, while throwing plenty of memorable characters at you for the game's duration. But this isn't just an off-brand Fallout New Vegas, I assure you. For starters, this game runs almost flawlessly, which is kind of shocking after enduring a decade where this specific type of RPG was dominated by Fallout New Vegas, Skyrim, Fallout 4, and Fallout 76. On top of simply working how you expect it to, the game plays surprisingly well as a shooter or as a first-person melee game, as well as offering plenty of non-combat skills to sink your RPG-hungry teeth into. And the way these skills are handled is really interesting as well. Instead of simply investing in a single skill, you spend your first 50 levels of that skill investing in umbrella skills, allowing you a much broader approach to the game's earliest sequences. Now, admittedly, this game hasn't really had the same time to occupy my brain as a lot of the other games on this list, but I could hardly put it down during my first playthrough, and it just blows my mind to have a game that's so well written, so satisfying to forge your own path through, and so functional after years of seemingly endless bugs. For Obsidian to show Bethesda up at their own game so handily is just mind-blowing to me.
Not likely, bootlickers. Initiate skip jump.
Number 3. Titanfall 2. 3 years ago I declared that Doom was my game of the year and the best shooter of the generation, but given time and distance, my view on it has changed. Doom is still great, don't get me wrong. Its soundtrack is an absolute ripper, and its non-stop action is certainly one hell of a time, but it's not quite a complete package. Have you seen its multiplayer? Now 2016's Titanfall 2? That is a complete package. Following on from a less than glowing multiplayer-only Xbox One launch title, Titanfall 2 was an improvement on all fronts. On top of adding more options and fine-tuning its wall-running, mech-battling multiplayer options, Titanfall 2 delivered a solo campaign that I don't think anyone was expecting. It would have been easy to simply make Call of Duty in space and mix in the series staples of wall running and mech fighting, and I would have been fine with that. Instead, Respawn delivered a campaign that was incredibly well paced, bringing new and exciting gimmicks to every other level and throwing Titan boss battles at you whenever the responsive platforming sequences started to wear even a little bit thin. Seriously, I can't think of many video game levels that stack up against the turbine-powered platforming of The Beacon, or the shifting assembly lines of Into the Abyss. And don't even get me started on the fantastic and entirely unexpected time-warping combat and platforming of Effect and Cause, which might be my favorite sequence in a shooter ever. Weirdly though, it's Titanfall 2's narrative that was most surprising for me. The story of a military grunt with aspirations of becoming a Titan pilot, something that is presented in-universe as the gun-toting equivalent of a goddamn Jedi, is interesting enough on its own, but then Titanfall 2 gives us the growing relationship between Cooper, our character, and the Titan he's been linked to out of sheer necessity. BT-7274 has such a straightforward and open personality, and the growing friendship between the two is heartwarming and wholesome, leading to a really impactful climax. The final 2 missions of Titanfall 2 are pure gold. Between mid-air shootouts, flying titans, and not only 1 but 2 high-action escape sequences, what's not to love? Honestly, I think Titanfall 2 might be the most underappreciated game of the decade.
IMC Titan acquired. Cooper, you're in bad shape. Hold on.
Number 2. Red Dead Redemption 2. This past decade has seen more open world games than anyone could reasonably count, thanks in part to the power of a new console generation that allowed developers to build more big and beautiful environments than they ever could previously. But while games such as Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Grand Theft Auto V seem to focus on the bigger picture, 2018's Red Dead Redemption 2 focused on detail while still providing a massive world to explore. I said this last year during my Game of the Year video, but it's worth repeating. Red Dead Redemption 2 is not a game for everyone. Its narrative is a slow burn, and its indulgent level of animation makes the gameplay less snappy than its predecessor. But I personally really enjoyed the core gameplay. It felt less arcadey, but as a result had a greater sense of weight behind it, and the open world is incredible. Red Dead 2's map has so many things to do, whether we're talking about scripted side content like bounty hunting and stranger missions, or random encounters and sequences you create for yourself like train and store robberies. The game features one of the best pure sandboxes, allowing you to engage with that world in a surprising number of ways, while also feeling like the lives of NPCs will carry on with or without your input, and it still manages to deliver in terms of narrative. Sure, the plot takes a while to really get going, but I loved slowly submerging myself into the world of wanted outlaw Arthur Morgan and the Van der Linde gang. You get a real sense for the family-like relationship of the gang, and Morgan himself is just full of depth. You can play him as an unrepentant gunslinger, but the narrative arc of the game casts him as someone at odds with where life has taken him, and the final act makes for the most heart-wrenching storytelling I've ever seen in a game. But the big question here is, why Red Dead 2 and not the original? And frankly, I still hold Red Dead 1 in high regard for completely different reasons. But I suppose the answer is that Arthur Morgan's tale of self-reflection did more for me than Marston's tale of burying his past, simply because the parts that dealt with John Marston and his relationship with his former gang members were few and far between in retrospect. Remember meeting Bill, Javier, and Dutch in Red Dead 1? If not, I don't really blame you. John Marston only shares a handful of scenes with them. But Red Dead 2 not only builds up its main players from the very beginning, it gives context to the relationships that are being ended in Red Dead 1. Red Dead Redemption 2 isn't just a more satisfying story for me, it also elevates the first Red Dead Redemption's plot as well.
Ain't that a nice way to talk to a lady?
Oh, I didn't know I was talking to a lady.
Excuse me.
Well, I must say, you got a fine way with the women, amigo.
Number 1. Bloodborne. Of the things that typified the past 10 years in video games, the phrase "like Dark Souls but" might be the most surprising to me. 10 years ago, the idea of a Souls-like subgenre of action RPGs would be crazy because we'd only have Demon Souls as a point of reference. Really, few things exploded quite like From Software's meat grinder game formula, and as far as I'm concerned, the pinnacle of that formula is my favorite game of the decade, 2015's Bloodborne. Bloodborne took the established elements of the Souls series, its intricately intertwined maps, its punishing but satisfying combat, and its genuinely terrifying boss encounters, and injected them with a shot of speed. Giving you lightning-quick attacks, a dodge that covers a wide area in an instant, and a health regeneration system that encouraged players to get back on the offensive after taking damage, Bloodborne was a much more aggressive beast than the series that spawned it. But that aggression isn't the only thing that kept this game occupying my brain space over the last 4 years. It's also got plenty of style. The shift from Western fantasy with Eastern influences to a full-blown Gothic Victorian style was a jarring change to be sure, but one that I was immediately on board for. Top hats, overcoats, and sick transforming weapons, I am so in for that. The cobblestone streets of Yharnam feel smothered by the towering structures that enclose them, and the horrors that lurk within start off unnerving enough with werewolves and monstrous crows, but as you dig deeper, learn more, everything takes a turn. The gothic horror of Yharnam's city sprawl gives way to deep, old forests and cities hidden from the mundane world, where Bloodborne's Lovecraftian underpinnings come to the forefront. Before you know it, the crows and werewolves of Bloodborne's early game are replaced with horrific fly abominations, crawling corpse piles, and mind flayers just waiting to break your mind in half. Bloodborne's slow descent into madness is easily the weirdest and most welcome surprise of the last decade. And with that descent into madness came some of the most jaw-dropping and satisfying boss encounters of not only the Souls-like genre, but of video games as a whole. The earlier Hunter showdown against Father Gascoigne stands out to me as a highlight, but you could pick any of the bosses from either the main game, the Chalice dungeons, or the extremely good Old Hunters DLC, and you'd probably pick a winner. This game is just too good, and I haven't even spoken about the functionally endless Chalice dungeons or the exciting PvP elements. Bloodborne is easily my game of the generation so far, as well as my favorite game of the past decade. How could it not be? So I guess that's about it then as we close the book on this past decade. It's been a decade of remasters and remakes, battle royales and live service games, and just so many microtransactions, but I'd be lying if I said there weren't some truly fantastic games released in the last 10 years as well. Now these are only 10 of my favourites, and they're the 10 I think are best, but I would love to hear about what you think are the best games of the decade in the comments below. Now until next time where we talk about the best games of 2019, take care, ka kite, bye bye.